Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. This episode includes discussion of ancient priestly activities, which can involve a significant sexual component. We engage with these ideas frankly and openly, but they may not be suitable for all audiences. Please use discretion when listening to this episode. Thank you. Hello everyone, and welcome to a History of Egypt podcast interview. My guest today is Courtney Marx. Courtney Marx comes to us as a representative of the American Research Center in Egypt, a long-running organization dedicated to the study of Egyptian society, culture, and history. This includes the ancient world, but also the medieval and modern periods. The ARCE has played a prominent role in Egyptian archaeology, history, and social studies for nearly a century. In 2024, the ARCE is celebrating 75 full years of operations. To mark the occasion, they reached out to organize this interview with Courtney Marx. Courtney joins us today to discuss topics from her master's thesis, which she completed at George Mason University in the United States in 2017. The subject of that research was the representations of the Amarna princesses and their religious role during the Amarna period. This research filled an important gap within the discussion of the Amarna period as a whole, particularly a greater emphasis on the daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, a uniquely visible part of their parents' regime, but also a group that was not well understood, especially within religious and political terms. Courtney's research contributed to a greater understanding of these phenomena, especially by comparing the princesses of Amarna with royal daughters of the earlier 18th dynasty, and how they had participated visibly in the royal court and regime. As you will see, the discussion is wide-ranging across time and space, but also remarkably detailed in the roles these royal women played within their society. I hope you enjoy my interview with Courtney Marx from the American Research Center in Egypt. And if you would like to learn more about that organization, stick around at the end of the interview. My conversation with Courtney Marx has 3 distinct chapters. First, we discuss the early 18th dynasty and the priestesses of gods like Amun-Ra. Then we move to Amarna to meet the princesses, daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and explore their role as political and religious representatives of the crown. Finally, Part 3 explores the aftermath of the Amarna era, the late 18th dynasty, and the beginning of the 19th. There will be time codes in the episode description if you wish to jump around. Now then, please enjoy my conversation with Courtney Marx. Hello, Courtney, and welcome to the History of Egypt podcast.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you very much for joining me, and obviously a big thanks to ARCE for arranging this conversation. I think it's going to be really exciting. So you are joining us from the eastern United States at the moment?
Yes, and at the moment it is sunny, so I have nothing to complain about.
Oh, very good. Very lucky. So, Courtney, you completed a master's thesis in ancient history, or the study of Egyptian history, specifically focusing on the Amarna period. And I will preface that by, noting that your research was not, although it was titled based around the Amarna period and specifically the princesses, there was very much a focus on placing the Amarna period in its suitable context, which you've also discussed in presentations for ARCE previously, which is that the Amarna period tends to get kind of cut out of its context and discussed in isolation. Can you tell my listeners a little bit more about why that happens and why it's a problem from a historical and scholarly perspective?
Yeah, so the Amarna period, I think, often gets separated from research and scholarship on the New Kingdom as a whole. Predominantly has to do with the religious reforms of Akhenaten, completely changing the hierarchy of deities, elevating the Aten as the supreme deity, relegating or basically trying to completely ignore other deities that were in prominent positions before the New Kingdom, and also the really unique artistic style of the Amarna period. When I was doing research for my thesis, I just kept going back and back 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, and discovering much more of the context and why Akhenaten made these decisions and why was this artistic style so unique. And the more context research that I did, the more I understood that these actions of Akhenaten and this artistic style were actually in line with changes that had begun much earlier at the advent of the 18th dynasty in the beginning of the New Kingdom, with changes to religious ideas, the elevation of solar deities as a whole. So putting the Amarna period kind of back in line with the rest of the New Kingdom really completes the story. It's slow changes. It's not exactly completely 180 that I think most people kind of refer to as the changes of the Amarna period. But again, these changes happened over time with previous kings and changes to religion and art as well.
Okay, that's very succinctly but comprehensively put. I like that. To focus specifically on your thesis discussion, you narrowed down on the princesses specifically, which to some in the audience might be an interesting choice because the Amarna period and the 18th dynasty are especially famous for these very powerful queens, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and so forth. So what drew you specifically to the princesses?
Well, my thesis advisor was Dr. Jacqueline Williamson, and she has done work, obviously, at the site of Amarna, and she had shown me a fragment of a relief of a princess, basically, and the princess was wearing their their typical sidelock, and we had discussions about, there's this sidelock and their iconography. It seems very strange for a lot of reasons that we'll most likely get into later. But the princesses in my research were so often referred to as children of Akhenaten, children, youths, adolescents. The terminology surrounding the Amarna princesses was very much almost relegating them to this child position. They were offspring, they were children. And so I researched the iconography and more broadly the roles within the religion of Atenism, but I really wanted to understand, were these representations simply showing them as children, or were their roles within Atenism more nuanced? And I don't really want to use the word power, but what type of roles were they given? They were more than just simply children of the king. They had a really unique position within the religion of Akhenaten.
So they weren't just adornments or accessories for the royal couple.
Yes, they were not simply child princesses, lounging around, eating grapes, being fed by a servant. They had very large responsibilities within the cult of the Aten.
Okay, and we'll come back to that a little bit later, but first we do need to place those ideas of religious roles, priestly roles, or priestessly roles, if that's an adjective. We do need to place that in the proper context of the 18th dynasty, which is something you go into in detail in your thesis and in your presentation for ARCE, which again I'll link to in the episode description. Broadly speaking, if the princesses of Amarna are dedicated to the Aten, that sounds unique because it's Aten and it's all very fancy and radical. But there is a previous tradition of royal women specifically becoming high-ranking members of what we might term the clergy of the New Kingdom state. And the strongest example of this is the title of the God's wife of Amun. So for those of my listeners who might not be familiar with the term, first of all, what is the God's wife of Amun, and what was their role as a priestess of that particular deity?
So the God's wife of Amun was a priestess that was dedicated to the service of the god Amun. And during the 18th dynasty, the god Amun was the patron deity, the city of Thebes. So the main roles of the god's wife of Amun were on par with other priestly duties at the time. So we have god's wives of Amun would play the sistra before images of the god to appease the god. Another duty would be to bathe in the sacred lake in preparation for engaging in rituals of worship, participation in processions for daily rituals of worship for Amun, in tandem with priests of the god as well. They would enter into the sacred spaces, including the Jezer Jezeru, or the Holy of Holies, where only the foremost religious figures could enter. They would also recite food offerings, or as I like to call it, the daily menu for the god, as food to be presented in offering for the god, burning wax models of enemies of the god. And again, most of these duties were done alongside the high priest of the god as well. So this was a very high level position of priestess in service to the god Amun.
Okay. And I would actually quite like to touch on something you just mentioned, which is, why do we call them God's wife of Amun rather than simply high priestess? Why do they have this specific title?
This specific title, and it can probably be explained a little bit better with the other title for the God's wife of Amun, which was the God's hand. And to put it as specific as possible, the God's wife of Amun was in position as the God's hand to assist the deity in his procreative masturbation. So basically, the god Amun would masturbate creation, and the god's hand, as an illusion, would assist the god in this procreative activity of creative masturbation. And in this way, the priestesses would be assisting in this creative process.
Okay. I'm assuming from the context of what you've described that this is not a role that you would find for the male priests. They would not perform anything similar or equivalent to Amun or any other deity?
Yes. For creation was viewed by the Egyptians as a procreative process, which meant that it required both male and female elements, required both male and female elements. So to assist a male god in a procreative process required a female element, required a female actor to assist the god in male and female procreative, creative action.
Okay. And for the early 18th dynasty, what kind of text or visual representation do we have that tells us about this role? You know, what is the core evidence for this description of their job?
So we have a stela, basically an endowment stela from the reign of Ahmose the first king of the 18th dynasty, endowed the position of God's wife of Amun. And this is, again, where we have the first instances of this priestess role was from the role of Ahmose I. He endowed this position with basically an estate for the God's wife of Amun. And so we have in this stela, it lays out exactly what was involved in this endowment, including funding, but it also laid out the chief responsibilities of the God's wife of Amun.
Okay. So just to summarize, make sure I've understood, the God's wife of Amun is, as a job, as a responsibility, is instituted at the very start of the 18th dynasty. There's no other evidence for it earlier than that?
We have evidence of God's wives of other deities beginning in the Middle Kingdom. But as far as God's wives of Amun, we have evidence for the endowment from Ahmose I, so from the beginning of the 18th dynasty. So we don't have explicit evidence of God's wives of Amun from earlier than the New Kingdom.
Okay. So the job pre-existed, but this is the first evidence for this specific deity. I won't ask about the Middle Kingdom because although that sounds fascinating, that would very quickly become a rabbit hole, and we don't have the time to go into that. But yes. We'll put a pin in that, and maybe, hopefully, we can discuss it more in future. So the God's wife of Amun is instituted, let's say, 1550 BCE, approximately, with Ahmose I. It then logically would develop over subsequent generations. what do we learn about it from later carriers of the title? Say, for example, the princess, later queen and king Hatshepsut. What do we know about the title after a few generations have passed?
Yes. So Hatshepsut took on the role of God's wife of Amun while she was queen to King Tutmos II.
Mm-hmm.
So Hatshepsut had taken on this very prominent priestly role during the reign of her husband and king. And Hatshepsut II's Tutmos II had died, and because his heir was Tutmos III was too young at the time, Hatshepsut was regent for her stepson, Tutmos III. So Hatshepsut ruled as regent, and Hatshepsut and Tutmos II had a daughter, Neferure. And so the title of God's wife of Amun was passed on to Hatshepsut's daughter, Neferure. And the passing on of this title in tandem with Hatshepsut taking on the role of regent and king really caused a stir as far as the questioning of who would rise to power after Hatshepsut. Of course, with Hatshepsut being regent, the logical conclusion was that Thutmose III would rule after her, particularly when he came of age. But with Hatshepsut eventually taking on full titularity of a king and bestowing the title of God's wife of Amun to her daughter Neferure, there was definitely concern that the royal lineage would bypass Thutmose III and be bestowed on Neferure, who would be, again, a second woman in power with the full kind of capacity of king in ancient Egypt. And that definitely was cause for concern for certain people.
Okay. What role does the God's wife of Amun title play in the rise of Hatshepsut? Is it a visible part of her transition, shall we say?
Yes, absolutely. So the title of God's wife of Amun was definitely used from its inception as a way to consolidate power, to add legitimacy to the rule of kings. So when Ahmose I came to power, it was at the end of the second intermediate period, which was very chaotic, which was violent, and which was a very turbulent time in ancient Egyptian history. So when Ahmose I came to power and he endowed his wife with the title of God's wife of Amun, it really cemented power fully in the hands of the royal family. Mm. So in many different periods of Egyptian history, there were clashes between priests in higher roles as well as with the role of king. So when kings gave higher priestly titles and positions to those in the royal family, it really consolidated power to be held fully within those members of the royal household. So when Hatshepsut was queen for Thutmose II, and she also held the title of God's wife of Amun, again, that meant that this royal couple was basically a powerhouse, was a very prominent religious priestly role that was held by Hatshepsut, while her husband, of course, was king of the two lands. Mm-hmm. And passing on the title to her daughter, again, having three members of the royal household having this much power really made the royal family this kind of powerhouse.
Mm. Yeah. It almost sounds as though they are monopolizing their political and religious authority by inserting the primary royal woman into the temple hierarchy.
Absolutely. Okay. That's a great way of putting it.
And I shouldn't ask this because it will get rabbit hole-ish. I might cut this out, but I'm just curious to know, for the gods' wives of other gods during the Middle Kingdom, are they also royal women, or do they seem to be just priestesses?
They were usually not royal women. So during the Middle Kingdom, they were typically just women who had, again, roles as priests, religious roles, but they were not necessarily royal women. We do have evidence of royal women also bearing priestly titles from the Middle Kingdom. The daughter, perhaps wife of Mentuhotep II, her name escapes me, Ma'it, the wife/daughter of Mentuhotep, Ma'it was, again, a royal woman by her titulary in relation to the king, but she also held titles for priestly roles as well.
Okay, interesting. I need to go back into the Middle Kingdom and dive deeper into that because it's so fascinating.
Okay. It is fascinating.
But I'll probably cut that out. I just had to ask. I had to know.
That's fine.
So Hatshepsut dies and passes her title, well, she passes her title in her lifetime to her daughter Neferu-Ra. Then logically Neferu-Ra dies at some point. I assume she's not still alive. After that, what happens to the god's wife of Amun? If we fast forward through the reigns of Amenhotep II, Thutmose IV, and to Amenhotep III, do we see the role carrying on? Does somebody like Queen T also play the part of the god's wife of Amun?
So the title God's Wife of Amun really disappears after the reign of Thutmose IV. So before Amenhotep III comes to power. There's definitely different theories as to why this is. Or one theory I've heard is that with the advent of Hatshepsut and bestowing the title on her daughter Neferu-Ra, trying to consolidate power within female members of the royal family, it was safer to establish the power of the king and not have the endowment of such a powerful female priestly role. When we get to the reign of Amenhotep III, his emphasis was much more on equating himself with the god. And so there was less of a kind of separation between the royal household and the priests, because the king was basically taking on an earthly manifestation of the god.
Okay. From the priestesses of Amun, we now move to the princesses of Amarna. For those listening on Patreon, it will begin right away. If you are listening on the public feed, there will be a short break, and then we'll be back. See you in a moment. That brings us then to the advent of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. With the Amarna royal women generally, how does the pattern change compared to what we saw under Hatshepsut in the early 18th dynasty? Do they use their own equivalent titles, say God's wife of Aten? Are they performing similar rituals or offering ceremonies compared to the women who came before them?
Yes, so princess representations definitely began to increase under Hatshepsut with her daughter Neferu-Ra, most likely in anticipation that Neferu-Ra would become king after Hatshepsut's death. So we have an increase in representations of daughters of the king, which only increased under Amenhotep III. We have an unprecedented number of depictions of king's daughters in Amenhotep III, and that number only grew under Akhenaten. And Akhenaten's daughters are most often portrayed in religious procession in ritual worship of the Aten. So the daughters of Akhenaten would be standing in religious procession, holding sistra, and would be shown again as these high religious figures within Atenism. So we have, again, the changes to the number of representations of daughters increasing throughout the 18th dynasty, in tandem with the changing religious roles of royal women with the title of God's Wife of Amun. And we arrive at the Amarna period with kind of both of these tools that Akhenaten utilized for the furthering of his cult, his religious reforms for Atenism.
Okay, so in your research, you've highlighted a few distinctive, I guess, visual characteristics of the Amarna royal women generally, not just the queen, not just the princesses, but all of the women who are in the palatial or courtly society. And the first one you highlight is the side lock, or the lock of hair that sort of falls down the side of their head. First of all, what's the significance of that side lock of hair within Egyptian culture up to that point? Why is that such a significant piece of costuming?
Since early in Egyptian history, we have side locks being used to distinguish children. Children were most often depicted either as wearing a side lock, which is often called the side lock of youth, or also they would be portrayed bald with no hair. And in my research of the Amarna princesses, the side lock that they wore is often referred to again as the side lock of youth. And part of my research was to determine, was this side lock merely an indicator of their ages or their adolescence, or was this side lock an indicator of something more? And if you're familiar with imagery of the Amarna period and you have seen images of the daughters of Akhenaten, you most likely have seen them wear a side lock. They are portrayed wearing side locks in nearly all of their images. And we have evidence for other figures wearing side locks. So we have the daughters of Akhenaten wearing side locks, and we also have members of the princess's household wearing side locks as well. So we have an example of the Lady Mut Benret wearing a side lock. And we also have one of the nurses of the princesses, a woman known as Tia, wearing a side lock as well. And when you look into the princesses and evaluate their ages, most of them were born between roughly regnal years 4 and 11. And the death of Akhenaten occurred in regnal year 17. So it's very likely that none of his daughters were older than 13, perhaps 15 years of age. And in our modern society, someone who's 15 or younger would most likely be considered a child. In ancient Egypt, these distinctions of the realm of childhood and adulthood are not so easily separated. Children, or figures that we would consider to be children, could be married women of their own household, could be having children of their own. So when we look at a daughter of Akhenaten wearing a side lock and she's standing in religious procession, this side lock is an indicator more so of her role and of her family connection to the family of Akhenaten. So when we have the princesses and their attendants who are wearing side locks, we see that it kind of creates this grouping of women within the household of the daughters of Akhenaten.
Okay. And just to clarify there, the side lock of youth generally, it's not specifically a royal symbol, is it? It appears for non-royal children as well in other iconography. So when we say that the Amarna women of the court, the princesses and the queen, have the side lock, it doesn't, that lock of hair alone does not mark them out as royal. It just marks them out as youthful women of the household.
Absolutely. We have many, many portrayals of children from all classes in ancient Egypt being portrayed with side locks. We have depictions from the tomb of Neb-Amun, and for an Amarna example, we have images of a child in the tomb of Penhezi as well. And these are not royal children. They are children of any walk of life, could be shown wearing a side lock. Okay.
And again, this is a tangent question that I'll probably cut because it's quite visual. Does the style of side lock change at all during the Amarna period, or is it the same? Like, is the braiding of it or is the bunching of it any different from what came before? Because I know obviously with like the UN Mutev priests, they have that distinctive curled one, but I think the Amarna ones tend to have just a sort of bunch, almost like a bunch of braids going down. Is there any change between what came before and the Amarna style, like just in the hair treatment?
Yes. So we do have a variety of styles of side locks. The most consistent within the Amarna period is definitely, again, that kind of bundle of braids at the side. We do have a curled side lock being worn by Akhenaten on the canopic sarcophagus of Tutankhamun when she is seated by the king and he is holding a bow. So we have images of later Amarna princesses in their role as queen wearing more of a curled side lock. And when we get into the Ramessid period, that side lock is almost exclusively a long side lock, although we do have examples of other figures within the Amarna royal court wearing longer side locks. For example, the nurse Tia, she is shown wearing kind of one of this longer style of side lock.
Interesting. Okay. I'll have to ask for a couple of pictures of those because, yeah, it's not something that I've ever looked at in any particular detail, but as we're discussing, I'm like, that would be an interesting thing to follow up on. Okay, so visually speaking, the Amarna royal women, not just the queens, not just the priestesses, but everyone who's in the palatial household has these markers, such as their hair, which places them within that social and economic sphere. From that, what kind of elements in their appearance or their costuming do the Amarna princesses have, which specifically identifies them as royal?
Mostly it's context. The Amarna princesses are rarely shown wearing any kind of explicitly royal regalia. So they're, mostly with their titles is how we identify them. So any type of textual information that we have near their depictions, definitely what we go off of. But they're often shown near the king or queen. Again, in procession is one of their most common forms of portrayal. And so we mostly have textual evidence as well as contextual evidence. They are being shown with the king and queen. And of course, we do have hierarchic scale where they are shown larger than other individuals of the court and for other royal attendees as well.
Okay. It seems strange that they don't have specific regalia because I immediately think of, say, the chair of Sit Amun from the reign of Amenhotep III, where she's wearing a crown. It's not what we would call a queenly crown or a royal crown, but it is a headdress or a head garment of some kind, which is distinctive and unique. Do you have any idea why we would have these elements before the court of Akhenaten, but then suddenly they disappear for his daughters, even though the daughters themselves are arguably more prominent than any other princesses before them?
Yeah, so for Amarna iconography, for their artistic style, the king and queen are often shown being reached out to by the hands of the Aten. So the king and queen will stand under the rays of the Aten, and the hands at the end of the rays will be touching the royal couple. And these are the only figures within the Amarna period that actually have the embrace of kind of the Aten's rays. The princesses often will stand under the rays, but the actual hands at the end of the rays do not touch the princesses, but they are still kind of encapsulated in this field of the rays of the Aten. And we have also king's cap for Akhenaten that definitely depicts his kingship. Nefertiti obviously has her very well-known unique cap that she wears. And she also does wear crowns associated with Hathoric symbolism as well, with a sun disk. But as far as the princesses, we don't see them wearing any type of special crown or cap unless they are married later on. So we have Meridaten's marriage to Smenkhare, where she is depicted as wearing a queenly cap. And then, of course, Ankhesenamen, when she is married to Tutankhamun, we have her also kind of wear these crowns as well. But as far as when they're actually Amarna princesses under the rule of Akhenaten, again, we mostly just have them depicted wearing side locks.
Okay. So does it perhaps have something to do with the idea that within the particular political and philosophical view of Akhenaten's regime, the only two people who really matter are the king and the queen, and everybody else, even if they are blood children or relatives, are on a lower order of existence than the king and queen?
Yes, there's a very clear hierarchy when it comes to the structure of the Amarna royal family. Akhenaten is the head, or at least I should say, as far as the earthly Amarna royal family goes. We have Akhenaten. Slightly under Akhenaten is Nefertiti, although she is, of course, considered very highly within the hierarchy. And the daughters, and in much of their representations, are very clearly shown as in service to their parents, in service to the cult, and basically assisting their parents with whatever kind of assistance that they would need.
Sounds terribly oppressive. I'm sure they must have been very rebellious later. So touching on that, you do highlight within your research that the princesses do have their own special priestly role, or a role that we would consider analogous to clergy within the regime. And there's a few elements that you highlight of the accessories they use, and in some cases the kind of deities they reference or invoke, even if they don't explicitly name them. So broadly speaking, first of all, what role do the princesses play as priestesses within the regime? And how do we identify that?
So the princesses played a role in basically perpetuating the renewal of the sun god, and in connection, the renewal of their father, who was an earthly manifestation of the Aten. So in most of their representations, we see the Amarna princesses wearing their side locks and carrying sistra in service to the Aten. And their number one role was in making sure that the Aten was renewed daily. To provide a little context, in the beginning of the 18th dynasty, we saw major changes to funerary texts, including the Amduat, which details the journey of the sun, dying at night and then being reborn each day. And in this solar mythology falls the Aten as well. The Aten needed to be renewed each morning at dawn. So when the Amarna princesses are in procession and carrying sistra, they are basically trying to awaken the self-creative process of the Aten, very similarly to the role of the god's wife of Amun. So the god's wife of Amun, as previously mentioned, would play sistra in helping the god to engage in his, again, masturbatory, procreative, creative efforts and in his daily renewal. So in the same way, the Amarna princesses would be shaking their sistra in order to have the Aten be rejuvenated each day. And this would not only be, the rebirth of the Aten, but this would be to ensure basically the continuance of the universe. So it was very important for all of Egyptians, and of course the Amarna royal family, that the Aten be renewed, because again, the continuance of life is a pretty big deal.
Okay. And at the risk of going beyond the evidence that we have, when we see the princesses rattling sistra, sort of shaking them, shh, if we were to interpret that literally, do you think that would primarily be a sunrise ceremony, or do you think they might do it throughout the day?
That's a good question. Yeah, as far as as evidence goes, I mean, we typically see them doing this under the gaze or the rays of the sun, which would at least mean that the sun had risen at this point.
It's always at the top of the scene.
But. Yeah, it's always at kind of its zenith. But yeah, I guess mythologically, there would definitely be symbolic value in perhaps doing this activity in kind of pre-sunrise dawn. But I'm unfortunately not familiar with exact evidence of when. Do know kind of more so where. We know that Akhenaten had special temples called sunshades constructed for Nefertiti and her daughters, where this kind of renewal of the Aten could be enacted.
Okay, and there's the second element of that question, beyond the sunrise. You mentioned for the god's wife of Amun and for the iconography, especially of Amun-Ra, that creation is a masturbatory act of male and female essences being brought forth to create the universe. The Aten famously is a far more distant and almost disembodied deity. Again, this might be going beyond what we can actually definitively say based on the texts and art, but what aspect of the Aten specifically would the princesses be attuning themselves to or evoking in order to guarantee the continuation of the universe?
So with solar deities, including the Aten, they were associated with creative process through its light and its warmth. So much of the mythology of solar deities has to do with the fact that when it rises, it provides necessary light and warmth for life to prosper. And that can include flora, fauna, and humans as well. So much of the depictions of the Aten and descriptions of the Aten really detail the fact that it's life-giving warmth as well as light. So these important aspects of the god were its I guess physical and sight manifestations of how it directly interacted with the world and how it provided life to everything. So this was much more mythologically based than actual. Yeah, you're entirely right. This was not a action that could be performed physically, particularly since with the Aten, it was the sun disk in the sky. You could not physically touch it. As we have, of course, images where the rays are touching Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti, but the princesses could not physically interact with the sun god. So instead, we have these kind of mythological examples, particularly in the mythologies of Re and Hathor. And as noted previously, with the changes to solar religion at the beginning of the New Kingdom, as well as funerary texts, we have the mythology of Re as the father and consort of Hathor. So when he dies, Hathor can give him birth at the dawn. And another mythology that factors in Hathor and Re is, of course, when Re sends Hathor to destroy Earth in the form of the goddess Sekhmet. Sekhmet, the vengeful lion-headed goddess, completely decimates humanity, well, nearly decimates humanity. And Re decides that no, he wants humanity to live. So through the use of a lake of beer and also through humans playing Sistra to appease the goddess, she is restored back to Hathor, who can then again provide rebirth and renewal to the god. So Sistra not only perpetuate procreative creation, but Sistra can also appease gods as well to make sure that they are able to kind of continue in these preset roles, basically, of providing life and renewal to the world.
Okay, because obviously the Aten he's not necessarily a unique god. He's simply another manifestation of Ra that is given a very hyper-specific name and identity by Akhenaten. But presumably much of the identity, or at least the storytelling around Ra, still had some relevance to them within this regime. But you touch on the idea that the princesses, as priestesses, are also invoking, or at least potentially performing the role of Hathor for the god Aten. Now, to some listeners, that may sound very strange because wasn't Akhenaten monotheistic? Didn't he deny the existence of all the other gods? Why would the Amarna princesses carry on using these symbols or these accessories that are mythologically or historically associated with a being like Hathor? Why would they be using the iconography of another goddess within a monotheistic regime? What's going on there?
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of goes back to the fact that the Amarna period was a product of its time. We have pre-established religious vocabulary and iconography of the Sistra being used in this way to renew and propitiate gods and kings. So we already have this set and established way for priestesses to interact with a god. And Akhenaten was, even though he completely changed things, he wasn't afraid of repurposing, again, these already established methods and tools of interacting with deities. So we have the Amarna princesses take on the role of priestesses and also taking on attributes of female goddesses as well. So before the Amarna period, again, we have the necessity of kings needing queens, of male gods needing female gods to kind of continue the universe, to engage in creative action. And with the rise of Atenism, we have the Aten being this sole deity. And although he can't, or it can have both male and female elements, the Aten can have both male and female elements. As for Akhenaten, who is the earthly manifestation, he needed a female element because Akhenaten by himself was wholly male. Oh, though we could go on tangents with it. But we have Akhenaten needing his female counterpart in Nefertiti. And we have Nefertiti taking on attributes of female goddesses, most notably Hathor. And the Amarna princesses also taking on attributes of female goddesses as well. So we have both elements needed for this creation, for this continuance of life in the nuclear Amarna family.
Okay. Again, to sort of just to make sure I've understood this correctly, although in the popular imagination, Akhenaten is a monotheist, we know historically that's not exactly the right term for him, and it's far more variable and there's far more nuance there. But Akhenaten himself, as a living human and as a king, is still the inheritor of certain traditions and habits of a culture that is thousands of years old. He doesn't seek to replace every single element of the religious system and hierarchy with his own unique inventions. He's quite happy to repurpose old ideas, even if they have old mythological connotations that he doesn't care about or that he's not interested in. He's still happy to use those symbols or those tools and that imagery in the service of his greater agenda. Is that a correct understanding?
Yes, that's a great way of putting it. And I think it's important to remember that for the Egyptians, deities and gods were not completely separate. They were not just dwelling in the heavenly realm. The gods of ancient Egypt were the foundation of their civilization. That is how the world was made. That is how the world continued to survive day after day. It was not simply a figure in a church that they would go to on holy days. Their gods were incorporated in nearly every aspect of their daily life. It would be pretty much impossible for Akhenaten to have tweezed out every single instance of any other god besides the Aten to remove that from the daily life of Egyptians. It would have been, I don't think that it would have even crossed his mind to do that, because again, Egyptian gods were so wholly incorporated into Egyptian thought, activity, and life.
Okay. You touched on this earlier with Nefertiti occasionally wearing crowns that are Hathoric. But then we do have the example of at least one princess, or two princesses, I should say, who definitely transitioned from the role of royal daughter to royal wife. The first one being Merit-Aten, and the second one being Ankhesenpa-Aten, or Ankhesenamun. For those two figures, we obviously have more or less visual representation of them as individuals. How does their appearance change? So, for example, how does Merit-Aten's appearance change from princess to queen? How does Ankhesenamun change from princess to queen?
So when it comes to Merit-Aten, I think the best example,
the one image.
The only example that we have from the tomb of Mary Ray II in Amarna is a wall relief with her and her husband, Smenkhare. So we have Merit-Aten next to her husband, Smenkhare, who was co-ruler with Akhenaten during his short reign, although things get a little chaotic at the end of...
Million nerds just said, actually.
Right, yes. Regardless of when Smenkhare ruled, Merit-Aten and Smenkhare were a royal couple. And in this depiction, we have Merit-Aten, who is no longer shown wearing a sidelock, but instead shown wearing a very rounded royal cap, which is a cap associated with a royal wife. So we have, at least in iconography, Merit-Aten stepping away from her role as merely royal daughter and into the role of royal wife with her husband, King Smenkhare.
Does she wear a crown? Does she carry any distinctive accessories, or is it just the cap? Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I think the scene actually might be so badly damaged it's kind of even hard to tell.
Yes. Yeah, it's very difficult to tell if she's holding anything in her hand, although, of course, we do have the royal couple standing underneath the rays of the Aten with its little hands reaching out to the royal couple. But yeah, unfortunately, the scene is sadly very damaged. And when I went back in 2019, it was nearly impossible to make anything out. So we basically just have to rely on drawings, mostly from Davies. But yeah, so we have Merodaughton explicitly shown carrying anything. The most recognizable aspect of her iconography in this scene is the cap with the tail fabric waving the fabric. Yeah, the scarf. That's yes, much better. The scarf at the back that. And again, the other aspect is, of course, that her name is in a cartouche in this scene, which would indicate kind of the elevation of her status as royal wife to Smenkhare.
Okay. And what about Ankes and Pa'aten / Amun? Obviously, there's the big asterisks of the return to orthodoxy and all that, but just purely focusing on the iconography, how does she match up between princess and queen?
So the iconography of Akhenaten after she marries Tutankhamun, it's very interesting. And kind of viewing her royal regalia next to Merodaughton, it creates a very distinct picture. So one of the best examples is the gilded shrine of Tutankhamun. So we have the royal couple. There are several scenes, but in one scene we have the royal couple where the king sits on a stool and the queen is relaxing on a fabric poof next to him, and she is gazing back at her husband. And the queen is wearing the short Nubian wig, but she also is wearing a curled sidelock. But in addition, she also wears a very tall crown with a Hathoric disc, a sun disc. So in comparison to Merodaughton, we see Merodaughton step away from use of this sidelock, showing her role as royal daughter, and moving on to simply wearing the queenly cap, again, to represent that she is elevated in status to queen. Whereas when Ankhesenamun is elevated to her role as Tutankhamun's queen, circumstances were quite different when she assumed her queenship. So by the time she married Tutankhamun and Tutankhamun became king, it is very likely that she was one of the last, if not the only, surviving daughter of Akhenaten at this time. So most of her family disappears, and we have basically Ankhesenamun as the sole survivor of the royal women of the Amarna household. So when we have Ankhesenamun wearing a sidelock, at least in my research, it seems to be that she is suggesting she is still king's daughter, but she is also king's wife. So she is having to kind of take on both roles because she does not have any other surviving family members. She also does not have any daughters that seem to have survived past infancy. So she does not have any daughters who could take on the role of royal daughter. And to kind of touch back on more of the mythological basis, when we have male and female elements necessary for creation, we also have kind of a split role between queen and princess. So queens represented the ability for kings to create offspring. Kings and queens create babies, and female babies are princesses. And princesses represented basically the potential to carry royal offspring of their own. So we have this basically continual cycle. We have queens who bear children, who are princesses, who can bear their own children, and the cycle repeats. So when we have a portrayal of Ankhesenamun who wears a queenly cap, she's showing, look, I am the royal consort. My husband and I will, I guess they hoped, would eventually bear royal heirs. But she also wears a sidelock saying, I'm still in this kind of potential phase. I can bear heirs for the king. So
interesting.
It's a cycle.
That seems like one of those very small details that could easily spawn a massive study of the iconography of royal women and why exactly you'd have a queen portraying herself also as a princess in some respects.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Point for future research, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's the immediate aftermath of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And of course, as listeners of the podcast will know, it's not a sudden break once Akhenaten dies. They don't just suddenly switch a light and everything goes back. But say 20 to 30 years later, depending on your chronology, the royal household has, for one, it's changed hands, and we now have this new family, the Ramessids, in power. And second of all, they are very overtly either disinterested or antagonistic to some elements of what Akhenaten and Nefertiti were doing with the idea of royal power. To make a very long story or question short, how does the visible role of the royal women change following the Amarna period, at least within the 19th dynasty? How is there, as some people would say, a backlash? Is there a reversion to old models? How, or is there not? Is there continuity? How does that imagery change?
Yes, the aftermath of the Amarna period, which we will skip over entirely because that is its own.
Not important.
Totally not
important.
So we definitely have aspects of continuity. We do have, of course, differences. First out of necessity, because so many of Akhenaten's successors either didn't have children that survived past infancy, or perhaps they were grown and in their own households and weren't fully incorporated into royal households. But we don't really have an expression of royal daughters that is shown in the very end of the 18th dynasty. For the advent of the 19th dynasty, we do have kind of a reestablishment eventually of a royal dynasty where kings had daughters and sons, and there was a familial line that continued. So as far as continuity goes, we do have reliefs from Abydos during the reign of Ramesses II that shows princesses, again, in processional order. And one interesting iconographic aspect is the fact that they wear long side locks. So it's funny because side locks were so ingrained in the representations of Amarna princesses, it would make sense that maybe another hairstyle would be kind of utilized or brought forward and used more often for kings that came after him. But side locks were still very much in use in representations of kings' daughters during the Ramessid period. Similar imagery can be seen in Medinat Habu from the reign of Ramesses III. Princesses are also shown with the sistra. So we have princesses during the Ramessid period who are wearing side locks and who are carrying sistra, again, in this kind of continuity of their priestly role as king's daughters. So even though so much from the Amarna period was anathema after the death of Akhenaten, the religious role of king's daughters was still very much in place throughout the entirety of the New Kingdom, basically.
Interesting. At least with Ramesses III, we can partly chalk that up to him very consciously copying Ramesses II for a lot of his iconography. But as you say, if the princesses are showing up at Abydos for Ramesses II in a very Amarna-esque style of costuming and accessories, would it be fair to assume that maybe some of these elements do maybe have an earlier genesis, and just the visual evidence happens to have only survived from Akhenaten? Is it possible that his regime doesn't make this change? It actually is just picking on something that's already happening.
Yeah, I think it's definitely important to note that these aspects are not purely Amarna. And in fact, it's Amarna utilizing previously established iconography. So it's not the fact that these were purely Amarna elements that were later incorporated into the art of Ramessid kings, but instead that these specific pieces of iconography were established earlier than Akhenaten's reign. It was utilized during Akhenaten's reign, and it continued to be used during later dynasties. So again, to our earlier discussion about the fact that Amarna is a product of its time, Akhenaten didn't decide to throw the entire rule book away. He worked with what was already there, which is pretty smart when you're introducing a basically completely new types of religious thought and ideas. And it makes complete sense if you want to explain your new ideas that you utilize tools that people are already familiar with. So it makes sense to have these pre-established concepts of how to utilize daughters of kings basically within your royal cult, that you would continue to use those elements. And because those elements were in place before Akhenaten came to power, it makes sense that the Ramessid kings felt more comfortable using these elements because they were not solely from Amarna.
Okay, interesting. So there's an interesting wrinkle to that situation, though, which is while, say, at Abydos, we see a classic Amarna-style procession of princesses, Ramesses II also brings something back with the royal and religious hierarchy, which is that he seems to reintroduce the title of the god's wife of Amun, which, as you noted earlier, it had sort of fallen by the wayside after Hatshepsut and her daughter Neferura. But then over 100 years later, Ramesses revives the title. It'll be like us reviving something specifically from the Victorian era as a member of the clergy or civil institution. What is the significance of that in your understanding and what you've looked at?
Yeah, if you look at the context of what is happening at the advent of the 19th dynasty, we see similarities to the advent of the 18th dynasty. We have the end of a very tumultuous period. So with Ahmose I, the end of the second intermediate period, he endows this priestess position. And again, at the end of the 18th dynasty, with the end of the Amarna period, we have the rise of the Ramessid kings, who are trying to consolidate their power because, again, with the end of a dynasty, we have the end of a royal family line, which means the introduction of a new royal family line. And as part of new rulers, you have to establish legitimacy for your reign. So it makes complete sense that these kings would want to consolidate power, would want to reinforce the idea that, we are the true kings of Egypt by reinstating the position of God's wife of Amun. And also the fact that the cult of Amun was being reestablished at this period as well, and the reinstating of the more traditional gods of Egypt.
Okay. And who does Ramesses appoint as the god's wife of Amun? I would assume he maybe has more than one within his long, long reign. But is it one of his wives, Nefertari, or you said Nofret, or is it one of his daughters that he appoints?
So we have Nefertari Meretmut, wife of Ramesses II, based on epithets in her royal tomb. And we have earlier examples of the wife of Ramesses I, his wife, Sitra, and then also the wife of Seti I is also shown to have the title and position of God's wife of Amun as well.
So Ramesses II doesn't reintroduce it. It's Ramesses I, arguably.
Correct.
Interesting. Okay, so the Ramessid family, the royal family institute, bring it back. Bring back the god's wife of Amun for arguably political and religious consolidation and legitimacy. What is the subsequent trend? Does that follow on the same way as the 18th dynasty? Does the power of the god's wives of Amun increase and then suddenly disappear? What is the trajectory of the role under the Ramessids?
So under the Ramessids, it was most often the wife of the king who held the title of God's wife of Amun. And the position continued to gain greater prominence at the end of the New Kingdom. And it gained kind of new context more at the end of the New Kingdom. We have, beginning in the 21st dynasty, we see kind of another tumultuous period where the kind of ruling of Egypt was split. So we had the cult of Amun and the priesthood of Amun in Thebes, who held power in that region. And throughout the next few dynasties, we have a series of outside conquering forces who came in. So we have the Libyans, we have the Nubians. And during this time, the position of God's wife of Amun was, again, we see the position and title was used to consolidate power. So we have a core of power in Thebes with the priesthood of Amun and the rulers that came out of there, who would establish their daughters as king's wife of Amun. And we see several instances of marriage alliances with Libyan rulers to, again, create treaties, to create these alliances between these warring factions of power. And then when the Nubian kings come in, they bestow the title of God's wife of Amun as a way to add legitimacy to their own reigns. And that is kind of the height of the God's wife of Amun. We see different forms of power and titulary assigned to women who assume these roles. And it's during the 25th dynasty that we have kind of this new rule where the God's wife of Amun title had to be passed on to a daughter of a king. So we have this kind of very clear set of rules for the adoption of the title to, again, kind of consolidate power within a very strict line of those who ruled.
So quite a radically different trajectory following the Ramessid period, and that unfortunately will be a story for another day. But the God's wife of Amun is certainly one of the more underappreciated but important roles within the ancient Egyptian priesthood. Is that accurate to say?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Courtney, that brings me to the end of my questions about the Amarna princesses and their religious context. That was a fascinating explanation. I learned a great deal, especially about the intricacies of the female priests and their symbolism. So thank you very much for sharing that and for discussing that with me. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation, and I hope in the future you'll consider coming back on the podcast to discuss the God's wife of Amun in its very distinct and different manifestations later.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Excellent. And before I go, I should ask, what does the future hold for you in terms of research? Is there anything you're working on right now or that you would like to be working on in the future?
Yeah, I am hoping to continue my studies in a doctoral program. So I'm kind of in process of seeking out different programs and finding the best fit for me. And depending on the program and faculty that I work with, I see so many different avenues of further research. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a lot more that can be discussed about one aspect that I touched on in my thesis, which is the distinction of the realms of childhood versus adulthood and how it was understood very differently in the times of ancient Egypt. And there's a lot of continued fascinating research in the context of the New Kingdom that starts much earlier in the Middle Kingdom, and how the roles of royal women really changed throughout the Middle Kingdom and into the Second Intermediate period.
Excellent. That sounds fascinating. So my very best wishes for that. I hope you find the program and the project that would most suit your interests and personality. So once again, thank you very much for coming on the show. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And if folks want to follow you online, do you have a social media presence they can follow up on? If they want to find your research, do you have anything available online for them?
I do. I have an Instagram where I post images of Egypt and other Egyptian collections that I happen to travel to. So I can definitely provide links for that. As far as online, I do have the video of one of my presentations for the ARCE annual meeting, and I hope to have publications released in the future as well.
Great. And I'll include links to all of those in the episode description. But once again, Courtney, thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
My thanks to Courtney Marx for joining us for this fascinating conversation. If you would like to learn more about her work, there will be links in the episode description. Courtney comes to us on behalf of the American Research Center in Egypt, or ARCE. The ARCE was founded in 1948 as a kind of sister organization to earlier ones for Greece and Rome. Together, these institutes have been a key component of ancient world studies for many decades. In fact, in 2024, the ARCE is celebrating 75 full years of operations, 7.5 decades of supporting researchers and scholars who are investigating the ancient world and how history can connect us to the present. In that time, the ARCE has hosted or supported countless scholarly conferences and symposia. They also run the Journal of the American Research Center in Egypt, which is an essential journal for academic Egyptology. In the modern day, they run a variety of projects, including archaeological excavations within Egypt, research endowments and support for students looking to engage with the ancient world, and a large variety of public-facing events. The ARCE hosts regular lectures by prominent Egyptologists exploring the work that is being done both in archaeology and in scholarship. They also run the American Research Center in Egypt podcast, in which prominent Egyptologists discuss aspects of the ancient world according to their specialties. These include a series on Tutankhamun and the kingdoms of ancient Egypt. At the moment, a series of podcast episodes are exploring the history of the ARCE itself and Egyptology more generally. I'll put a link to the podcast in the description if you're interested. Finally, for the enthusiasts, the ARCE has recently taken over management of the Theban Mapping Project. This is an online database and website that records and presents information about the royal tombs of Thebes, especially the Valley of the Kings, the Valley of the Queens, and the associated monuments around. The Theban Mapping Project was started in 1978 by Dr. Kent Weeks, and is now funded primarily by the American Research Center in Egypt. If you have ever used the Theban Mapping Project or have enjoyed my episodes about those monuments, the ARCE has been a key component in supporting those resources. So they do good work, both for scholars and researchers, and for the interested public. You can find the American Research Center in Egypt at arce.org. I'll put a link in the episode description should you wish to visit. I highly recommend checking them out. This brings us to the end of today's episode. Once again, my thanks to the ARCE and their representatives, Courtney Marx and Jeanne d'Arc, for reaching out to organize this interview. I hope you have enjoyed this discussion about the Amarna royal women and the priestesses of New Kingdom Egypt. For now, that's all from me. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you soon.